Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of our series of pre-conference video conversations, MM+M Transform Talks. The intent here is to start the conversation on the future of health marketing ahead of the virtual MM+M Transform Conference, which is slated to take place September 30th and October 1st. I'm Marc Iskowitz, Executive Editor at MM+M, and I'll be your host for this 25-minute conversation. And joining me for this discussion is my special guest, Ellie Siegel, who is CEO and founder of the consultancy Longview Strategic. In that capacity, Ellie advises biopharma companies on the emerging market for medical marijuana. She's also principal and host of an event series called Accelerate Cannabis, besides being a partner in a general corporate law practice. We're going to give sort of a cannabis catch-up for medical marketers, including how COVID has affected progress of the field and what kinds of developments Ellie expects on the horizon. Ellie, first, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Marc. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So let's just get into it here. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. It's pretty diverse, pretty wide experience set. My undergrad was at NYU at Tisch for theater, law school after that, business school after that. And, it was all in a trajectory, I think, to get to a career related to something I was passionate about. So I launched myself into this consultancy and the law firm in 2015. The reason I did so was because I saw medical marijuana developing as a highly regulated industry that I assumed would come to my geographic region at some point. That said, I was lucky timing-wise and also well situated. They passed legislation years ago in New Jersey that was somewhat limited. Better legislation in Pennsylvania in 2016. And obviously since then, this whole region in the mid-Atlantic has just become sort of an expanding and growing market for cannabis. And at the same time, hemp has really become something in all of the country, but certainly these states that has opened up and created opportunity for a lot of people. So against that backdrop, after I started those companies, I realized that the biggest gap I would say that exists is between the existing cannabis industry and pharma. They don't speak the same language yet. They're not on the same plane just yet. So as somebody who had a lot of different education, but nothing that really lent itself to pharma, I pursued postgraduate certificates in medical product development and regulatory affairs and compliance for pharmaceuticals. Obviously, my focus is on cannabis, but you can see that I did that a couple years ago with an eye on the future, assuming that this would be a conversation I'd need to participate in. And so all that said, I think from this wide variety of backgrounds that I came from, I can tell you for sure that the cannabis space lends itself to just about anybody that might be interested in it. And you can come to it from just about any angle. So as marketers, I assume your audience is interested in where they can fit in the future of this space. And I would offer up that there's a wide set of openings. I mean, that the window is not limited.
Sure. You hit the nail on the head. I think some of them really are probably have their eye on this space, at least for sure. And we'll get into that more coming up. When I was planning this talk, and you know this because we went back and forth before this, but I was thinking we'd kind of frame it around how progress for cannabis and hemp and medical marijuana has been affected by COVID. But let's also have you just spend 30 seconds explaining for those who don't know the difference between cannabis and hemp.
Sure. It's kind of fun to go over this for me anyway, because it's the thing that makes a light bulb go off in people's mind. They think of hemp as something that they've accepted for quite some time. They've seen it in clothing and things like that for decades now. And cannabis has always seemed to be something that's more stigmatized. And yet cannabis encompasses marijuana and hemp. And so the greater word cannabis, the best metaphor that I can give is it's equivalent to saying if you took dogs, right? There are breeds of dogs. We all know how dogs work. If you have a Saint Bernard and you have a poodle, they're both dogs, but they're bred for completely different purposes and they serve completely different purposes. And, within a poodle variety, there's toy poodles all the way to standard poodles, right? So there's all these variations that you can get into. And I use that metaphor just to say cannabis is the sort of overarching, category that would compare to dogs. And under that is hemp and medical marijuana. And within each of those, there's a wide variety of breakdown in purpose, how it's cultivated, why it's cultivated the way it is, for what purpose. And so that to me is most important for people to understand that it all originates from the cannabis plant. It just is used for a myriad of different purposes that range from medical to textile. It's really certainly not a panacea, but there are a wide variety of uses for cannabis.
Okay, great. Thank you for doing a little bit of a one-on-one there. How about if we have you just give a little bit of a state of play now, and how would you say the pandemic has affected things?
Sure. So COVID surprisingly has, I think, expedited a lot of the cannabis reform that we've been wanting to see from the industry side. So the pandemic initially threatened the industry, but fairly quickly there was a response from governors in most of the states where medical marijuana is legal, and many of the states where adult use is largely distributed. Essentially, they came together very quickly to say cannabis is essential. And that's the question of what essential meant at the time, I think was, was it life sustaining, or was it quality of life sustaining? What did essential really mean in a window where, businesses were being shut down or kept open based on whether or not they were essential? And so the meaning of the word essential got pushed and pushed, and finally, at least in the Northeast, they clarified that it was life-sustaining was what they were determining to be essential businesses. And in most cases, they clarified that cannabis is essential. It is something that was not shut down, even briefly. Most places, there were
point of view.
From the distribution to the patient point of view, and even in adult use markets, to wider consumers. But there were places where it was shut down for a period of time. There were states where the adult use program, was halted and medical marijuana was allowed, to go forward. But overall, the notion that cannabis is essential, that's an advancement from the industry side that we couldn't have necessarily seen as a definition for these products. I don't think in any other circumstances. I'm not sure what would have caused that to happen outside of this pandemic. So that said, now that that's happened, the stability of the industry, I think, has been reinforced. The quality of the products, I think, has been acknowledged, and the dependency of some of these patients on the products to give them the quality of life that they would like, it's not anecdotal anymore. There's so many states and there's so many patients that they almost didn't have a choice but to deem it essential. That said, in deeming it essential, it didn't make it easily available necessarily during a pandemic. So the other thing that happened that was what I would call a big advancement for the space is that many states that are highly regulated, that had very tight regulations about how you could acquire the medicine, essentially opened up so that the patients had better access. And so delivery, curbside pickup, there are all these access points that just didn't exist pre-COVID. And so as much as it's reinforced that it's an essential product and an essential industry, it's also opened up the markets to some extent. created opportunity, more jobs. And at the same time, it's, I think, in a lot of ways shown that cannabis is something that states and the country could depend on to generate tax revenue. And at a time when you're, looking at budgetary issues that now exist in almost every state, I think you're going to see COVID really sort of accelerate the tempo and pace at which cannabis is accepted in states around the country.
Wow, you talk about silver linings. Those definitely seem like advancements in the thick of a pandemic, for sure.
Yeah.
Those are things that the industry can point to, as they advocate for themselves going forward. It's also an important point to touch on because, technically speaking, all CBD ingestible products, except for one FDA-approved product, were technically illegal. And we saw the FDA release some draft guidance over in the spring or late spring, early summer. So I just thought maybe we could drop anchor on that one for a moment. How is the lack of enforcement policy affecting the cannabis industry? And how do you see, what kind of feedback, have you seen the industry giving to that draft guidance?
Sure. On the hemp side, it's really, that's the space that we're talking about specifically. On the medical marijuana and adult use side, they're so highly regulated state by state. It's very, very tight. And there is very little confusion, to be honest, as to the regulations. They may not be the best regulations in every state, and they have some intricacies, but there's not a whole lot of confusion as to the enforcement of those regulations. On the hemp side, what you have is what seems like sort of a stagnancy in the enforcement scheme. I'm not sure exactly, what the future will hold in that sense. But until we see evidence of enforcement, it's hard to know how the regulations and the enforcement actually relate to one another. So, for example, there's been recently, some new guidance. The DEA views hemp and cannabis, on their requisite schedules, and there's clarification as to how they view them. But it doesn't really change anything, and it really just declares that hemp has to stay under this, a very small amount. It's 0.03. It's a percentage that it's minimal, and so to say that it has to stay under that amount of THC to be considered hemp is nothing new. It didn't actually change anything, and so it's just a catch up, I think, in the regulation trickling down through these agencies at a snail's pace. And in terms of enforcement, I don't think we have any clear guidance on what that's going to look like. It doesn't come from the regulation necessarily, because a lot of these regulations have been out there. But I hate to say this update in that sense is in a bit of limbo, because the CBD industry is going to be thrown off by COVID. That's happening. There's many mom and pop sort of hungry entrepreneurs on the CBD side that are just going to go out of business or have trouble with their supply chains, with a myriad of things related to COVID. The more secure brands, though, it's not just business as usual. They have normal distribution channels, Amazon, CVS. They're secure because they're CBD brands that are more prolific. They're, subscription box models and things like that. Not these small mom and pop operations. And I think you'll see that type of CBD producer succeed, and this time, most likely will help them into the future. Some will suffer as a result of having oversupply. Certainly, you'll see some of these larger CBD companies struggle because they just aren't getting the exact regulation and enforcement that they were hoping for at this point, maybe because of COVID slowing things down, or maybe because these agencies just are handling this at a snail's pace. So it's going to take a lot of capital. It's going to take a lot of time for the more secure CBD brands to make it and weather through this storm. But I think it's going to cause a sort of elimination of the less secure brands and a consolidation that ultimately I think will benefit the consumer. And I think you'll see enforcement of what remains post-COVID. And at that point, we'll really understand how the enforcement is going to guide the future of that space.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we, speaking of enforcement, we saw the FTC rattle its saber a little bit at that Hearst event that you spoke at, and then I attended earlier this year. But do you think that will keep out, say, pharmaceutical companies from investing in the space, that threat, this limbo period? And how do you see, capital coming from pharma markets to help accelerate this nascent industry?
Sure. It's a funny animal in the sense that you would think that these would be threats that would drive pharma off. The reality is that this is the challenges that a stigmatized early stage, expanding industry is going to face. Pharma knows that. I have pharma clients that have sat down with cannabis operators. We hold meetings where they try to, understand at what point they'd be on sort of a track to be able to partner, or where those opportunities will arise. The light switch will go on. And so the way I view it, at least with my pharma clients, and I make this very clear, is that diligence must be done. You must understand the space, and you must be prepared to plug into it someday. You can't just expect that day, you decide you want to engage with cannabis and you're going to be able to. The pharma companies have to be doing advanced work right now to be in the right position at the right time, but that light switch is going to flip. And so, essentially with my pharma clients, I present opportunities one after another. They go through with their legal and they come back and tell me no, and that's fine. And then, I just keep presenting opportunities. And there's going to be a day when the light switch flips and legal starts to say yes instead of no. And the conversations, will progress at that time. And so for me, it's not a matter of whether pharma will be there. They will be there. It's a question of in what way will they find the most success as a pharma industry, and, for your audience as marketers and professionals in a pharma space that's now inclusive of something that is a plant-based medicine that had been stigmatized for decades, and how do you move that forward? And so one thing I describe to people, sort of going back to a 101, 30,000 foot metaphor, if you look at the country and you look at core competencies of the country in different regions, in my mind, the easiest thing to sort of give as a description of where we're headed is if you've ever seen Game of Thrones, it's a TV show. Lots of people saw it on HBO, right? Maybe you didn't see it. I'll tell you, the only part that I'm alluding to is the theme song. During the theme song, they show a map where they fly over all these different kingdoms, and the camera view shows, fiefdoms rising and falling, and that's the progression of the show. It's seasons and seasons of these kingdoms rising and falling. And so what I'm drawing out in the comparison to cannabis is essentially, if you looked at the map of the United States and you said, right now, there are core competencies in these regions all over the country. And because of the way that cannabis regulation works, and the state by state models, we're not able to take advantage of the core competencies of all regions. We're not able to take advantage of efficiencies of scale that we could, in a future with better regulation. And so what I would propose is that the United States will rise in the cannabis space in the way that it knows how. And so in the South, you'll see big ag, and you'll see them, farming, and the farmers will have a huge stake in the future cannabis industry in the South. And in the Northeast, we do research and we do pharma really, really well. And we have in New Jersey, 10 of the 12 largest pharma companies. That's maybe a little bit old, but not far off. So, if you're talking about the Northeast doing what it does well, I would propose that that's likely to be in university and hospital research of cannabinoids and in development of medical products on the pharma side. And that doesn't mean that at a time where that happens, that the Northeast will be the only region to benefit from that. I'm just proposing that that's when that kingdom will rise in its own way, doing what it's good at doing. And you'll see that around the country as these regions are able to. And I would just say to those who are concerned that this has gone on for years and they may be late to the game, you're not. And we're probably in season 3. That's how much more of the story and how many more characters' heads will be chopped off, and new characters will become our favorites. And so, to come into the industry at this time from the pharma industry, or to bridge that gap, I'd say you're perfectly situated. And if anything, you're on the late side of early, but you're certainly not too late.
Right. And as we see all those fiefdoms and kingdoms rise and fall, and the jousting that's set to take place, we know there's a lot left to the story. The ancillary products and services industry, meanwhile, seems to be doing pretty well. But for the pharma folks that are on the sidelines watching the map from 30,000 feet up, and they're considering how their pharmaceutical talent could be leveraged in a space like this, and their experience, with a startup or a competitive venture. Can you just touch on that for a moment?
100%. That is part of what my company does. We work with multi-state operators on the cannabis side. We work with, pharma companies that are trying to understand their opportunity set. And we work with individuals who are trying to either make a lateral or better transition because they have a skill set that's needed in the cannabis space. In order for the cannabis industry to move forward, and from the cannabis side, for them to be able, to bridge the gap, they need to bring in talent that has that experience set. And so one of our functions, I'm not a staffing firm, but I do work with individuals to understand what their background is, what their experiences have prepared them for, help them understand the industry that they're trying to enter, and package their CV, bio, resume in a way that it speaks to the cannabis industry. Because one of the things I mentioned earlier on is that right now they are still speaking slightly different languages. And so I kind of look at my company's services as an interpreter. We really, right now stand between the cannabis industry and pharma, whether it's companies or individuals, and we help them understand where they fit in. And so for individuals out there, you fit in. There is a place where everyone's background and skill set is relatable and useful in the cannabis industry. And I would say that anybody who has advanced degrees, pharma industry background, and a real experience in marketing in highly regulated spaces, you are far more prepared and better situated to make a transition into marketing cannabis products than you think, probably. And so I love to offer people in that situation advice because it's industry building for the cannabis side. From my perspective as an ancillary service provider and an advocate for cannabis reform, my goal is to see the most sustainable, responsible, sophisticated cannabis industry possible. And to get there, we need to welcome with open arms folks that have pharma industry experience, any highly regulated industry experience, specifically pharma, though. When you're talking about marketing medical products, the cannabis space needs to view their medical dispensaries, the medical products that they're developing, and how they market them, needs to be very tight and very strategically planned to be compliant and also persuasive. So if you're somebody who likes challenges like that, cannabis would be a great space for you.
If there's one thing that pharmaceutical marketers know well, it's how to keep to the regulations, but be creative within those regulations. So I think it's potential.
That's what we need in cannabis, Mark. If I tell you the whole point of, Accelerate Cannabis as an example. So Accelerate Cannabis is my events brand you mentioned. That is a creative way to give people the opportunity to market that they otherwise don't have because the regulations might preclude it. So for example, a cannabis brand may not be able to hold an event with, panels and market it and sell tickets to it because the regulations prevent them from allowing their brand to be associated with something that maybe isn't deemed educational or isn't within, the framework that the regs would allow. So what we did to help the industry build itself was created a space where those operators could participate, could sponsor, could sit on panels, could impart knowledge, and ancillary service providers, had a place to let people know what their services were and how they could benefit the industry. And then entrepreneurs and folks like your audience who want to find opportunity and want to understand, how they fit in, could attend. And so in the physical event world pre-COVID, that's how Accelerate Cannabis worked. We did live events to try to drive the industry forward in a way that was opening it up to other industries and welcoming them in. So now, right, post-COVID, what do you do? How do you market? How do you get the message out there? Especially at a time where in some places legalizing, whether it's adult use or medical marijuana, it's on the ballot in November, or, legislators in some states are being challenged by their governors to find a way, to expand the cannabis market or pass regulations that expand it. So this is a really unique time. And one thing that we're doing, if anyone wants to see acceleratecannabis.com, we are flying banner planes. I mean, this is talk about creative marketing. We need to keep advocating. And so we're running an aerial advocacy campaign on the Jersey Shore that just tells people to get out and vote yes on November 3rd. And if you're New Jersey residents watching this, if you don't know why you should vote yes, tell me. I would love to have a conversation with you about it. But that is just an example of how we continue to evolve in the cannabis industry with whatever challenges we face. We know we have to get our message out there and we have to find a way. And that to me is creative marketing. And so,
Sure.
That's happening in the next couple of weeks. It's something to watch out for. Not just in New Jersey, but in a wider sense. Leading up to the election, you're going to hear a lot about why cannabis markets should be expanded. And that expansion is what's going to create the opportunity for folks that are in the pharma space, to be able to integrate more and more and feel less like it's a risky proposition for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. De-risking the proposition, if you will.
That's right.
And in an election where there's a lot at stake, it's yet another issue that is at stake and to be interested in. So, well, thank you, Ellie, for going into the weeds, as it were, here with us on this MM+M Transform Talks. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I appreciate that you invited me, Mark. I love talking to audiences like yours about the cannabis space, and I'm available, reachable on the internet, and I'm sure through you. If people have questions, I'm always happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much. And you want to just throw your email address out there once for the folks at home?
Sure, absolutely. It's easy. It's just my first name, Ellie, Ellie, at longviewstrategic.com. That's my consultancy. Again, it's Ellie at longviewstrategic.com.
Okay, great. There you have it. Let's do this again soon. And great. And I want to remind our audience that you can join us virtually for the live discussions on the future and networking at the MM+M Transform Conference, which is coming up September 30th and October 1st. Link to register in the description. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.